Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 25 of the regular season between the Sharks and the Ducks, in which the Sharks have managed to win 3-1. So finally, not only do the Sharks have their first 3-game winning streak of the season, they have also done what seemed impossible for this team. They have managed to go into one of these mini 2-game series against a team and actually take all 4 points that were available, all 4 points that were on the table, something they had failed out maybe 10 or so times already this season. And this one was definitely, while not so much convincing on the scoreboard as the previous game, which was a 6-0 win for the San Jose Sharks, it felt as though the Sharks were definitely a good amount better, at least in the early portions of this game. The first period, the Sharks would have the only goal that would come from Evander Kane to make it 1-0 San Jose. Into the second period, the Ducks would actually manage to tie up the game with a goal by Jones as he gets one past Jones in this regard, but just a few moments later, less than a minute, Kevin Labanc gets the lead right back for the San Jose Sharks, and they do not look past from that point. The Sharks would add one more in the third period, Dylan Gambrell's first of the season, and that would be the final score at the end of 60 minutes. And as I said, the Sharks, unlike in the first couple of periods last game where Dubnyk had to bail them out a few times, while Jones did have to bail out the Sharks a couple times here, I felt as though the Sharks were better defensively, and maybe while they weren't getting as many great offensive chances, or at least not burying on as many great offensive chances, all around it was still a very solid game, capping off a very solid weekend for the San Jose Sharks. First thing to talk about would, of course, be Martin Jones. So even though Dubnyk technically made a case for himself to get the second half of this back-to-back as well as the first half of the back-to-back, smartly and rightfully so, Booner ends up going back to Martin Jones, and it ends up being a very good choice for them, or for him. Martin Jones ends up having a very nice game here tonight. Technically, it is worse than Devan Dubnyk. It's very simple math. You see, letting in one goal does seem to be worse than letting in 0 goals, but still a very impressive performance from Martin Jones nonetheless. Some solid rebound control, only a couple of really shaky moments in that regard, I would say. This goal by Max Jones, I would say, was somewhat savable. Martin Jones was a bit off of his angle, and I believe this shot ends up deflecting off of the top of the pad of Martin Jones before going into the net. So technically, Jones could have capped off a second straight shutout here for the San Jose Sharks, but certainly can't really blame him for letting in just a single goal, as there were some nice chances and a couple of really nice, especially glove saves for Martin Jones here tonight. This, of course, this good performance is actually boding quite well for the San Jose Sharks, as while their next game, I suspect Dubnyk will find himself back between the pipes, considering the fact that over the next 5 weekends, the Sharks will have 5 back-to-backs. It is good that both goaltenders try and get rolling here, and we'll see if this type of strong goaltending that the Sharks have gotten during this 3-game winning streak can continue. It's doubtful, considering all the signs in the past for the San Jose Sharks, but let's hold out hope anyhow. Next, I'll be talking about Matt Nieto, my mistake. Nieto was a bit more of a low-key, I would say, acquisition during the offseason. The Sharks did not too much during a pretty hectic offseason for a lot of other teams. The cap was staying quite stagnant. The Sharks obviously had a ton of big contracts that would be difficult to move, and I do know Doug Wilson also wanted to keep the team relatively the same to see if they can bounce back. So besides a couple of, acquisitions through trade of Devan Dubnyk and Ryan Donato, it was mostly just, shoring up some depth and picking up Patrick Marleau. And one of those shoring up depths moves was to get Matt Nieto back, a player who the Sharks had a few years ago, but was waived and picked up by the Colorado Avalanche at that time. And Matt Nieto has looked quite solid for the San Jose Sharks. He's managed to retain his spot in the lineup each and every game thus far this season. And with the injury to Rudolph Balcer, who has not played this tonight and the previous night, Nieto was actually moved up to the second line with the returning Tomas Hertl and Timo Meier. And that seemed like a weird choice at the beginning. I thought maybe John Leonard would get a look up there. I thought maybe, Noah Gregor maybe could be pushed up there if necessary. Donato obviously could go back to the second line. But Booner ends up surprisingly going with Matt Nieto, and he's actually worked out quite well in that spot. Nieto had a bunch of great opportunities here tonight. Probably could have scored, 1 or 2 goals. There was the shorthanded breakaway where he hits the post, and just a couple of really nice opportunities. Unfortunately, as I said, unable to bury there, but the fact that he was putting himself in positions to capitalize was obviously a great sign for the San Jose Sharks. Once Balcers does return from injury, I suspect Balcers will get back his spot on that second line, and Nieto will likely return to the fourth line, but it's nice to see him chip in. Next, I'll be talking about Evander Kane. He once again scores a goal here. He now, I believe, leads the San Jose Sharks in terms of points, and he's just been a very strong forward for the San Jose Sharks this season. And I think really one of the big things to mention of Evander Kane, which hasn't necessarily been the case in the previous years with the San Jose Sharks, the previous couple of seasons, is how much more disciplined Kane has been this season, and especially as of late. You know how I've been pointing out that this first line for the Sharks, Couture, Kane, and the bank has looked good and has been together for a few weeks. Well, it just so happens to correspond with the fact that Evander Kane has only a single minor penalty taken over the last 12 games. So just 2 minutes being sat in the penalty box for Evander Kane over that time period, which is about a month plus of terms of games. So Kane has been staying a lot more disciplined, and you can feel that he's a lot more sort of locked in to the game, making a lot nicer plays, and he's been rewarded quite heavily. He's getting tons of ice time, tons of power play ice time, tons of penalty kill ice time, first line ice time. Just he seems to be, up there with Couture, the two best forwards for the San Jose Sharks this season. And I don't think, with how Meyer has been quite up and down, Hurdle has been quite up and down, I don't think that is necessarily a controversial statement at all, and I don't even think that it's particularly close. It seems to be, Couture here, Kane maybe right there with him, and then a pretty steep drop off before we get to a third forward in that regard. And finally, I'll talk about Brent Burns. So much has been said in the past few games about Erik Karlsson, about how fantastic he has looked. But Erik Karlsson here tonight was a bit more tame, I would say. Certainly not bad. Still pretty solid, I would say. But Brent Burns was maybe the one who stole a bit of that spotlight. It wasn't crazy offensive plays from Brent Burns, but it was a solid game. And of course, in the end, Karlsson ends up with 20 minutes, and Brent Burns once again ends up with 26 minutes. You see Booner in the last couple of minutes of this game trying to protect a 2-goal lead. Brent Burns basically gets every single second that is on the ice because of how much faith Booner as well as the rest of the team have in Brent Burns to kill off these last few moments of a game when the Sharks do have a lead. And so Brent Burns, I had pointed out how his stock was maybe dropping a bit. He had been struggling as of late, but this was a nice little game to help him get back up there. As I said, it wasn't an insane offensive performance like we've seen from Erik Karlsson the past couple of games, but it was just a very solid performance and something that we'd love to see from Brent Burns going forward. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Monday as they will take on the Golden Knights. So it's all well and good to be able to beat up on the Anaheim Ducks, the only team that finds himself below the San Jose Sharks in the West Division standings. But the Sharks are now back up in the Big Boys Club as they'll take on, I believe, first place in the West Division, the Vegas Golden Knights, for a couple straight games, and they lost to them just about a week ago twice in a row, a 5-4 overtime loss and a 4-0 shootout loss. They have yet to actually beat the Golden Knights this season. They are 0-for-3 against them, and we'll see if they can finally get a win in that regard and maybe extend this to a 4-game winning streak. Class dismissed.